Alright, there have been no deck doctor requests, and well, I've made a lot of decks for the game already, so I thought we would talk a little bit about how our sort of decks and playstyles fit into the meta of Domain, because there is something of a meta now, even though there hasn't been a tournament. I will do a better meta breakdown after the tournament, talking about what you should bring to not ladder, because it's not ladder, but online. So let's, I guess, hop into it. So, oh, hang on, I need to change my color. Cool. So actually, let's think about decks as three sort of styles. So you've got aggressive decks, then you've got control decks, and then in the middle, you've got just these sort of, I don't know, we'll call them mid-range, but it's not quite like that. So first off, you're gonna have card or decks like manaless aggro. That's in like the very first sort of tier of the spectrum. So we'll depict manaless aggro by drawing. What's manaless aggro? Just draw a 0. So manaless aggro here. It's yeah, it's the fastest deck ever. Now, like we've talked about before, if you're slightly faster than your opponent, you will almost always win. So manaless aggro should beat these decks. Wait, did we talk about that? I think we actually said if you're slightly slower than the opponent, you'll always win, because that's true. If you're a lot faster, you will always win, for the most part. So manaless aggro should beat these decks here, right? These decks, well, let's think about what manaless aggro actually beats. Well, it beats Hydra. It does really well against Hydra, specifically because it runs Crabulous. So any water decks, for the most part, are going to go here. They take a turn to develop mana, and then they also take a turn to flood and all that. And by the time they've done all that, and finally they can afford their 20 to 40 cost cards, aggro's just got them beat. So yeah, that's about a 0. So yeah, these decks will usually win against these decks. But these decks do beat the sort of later, later end of the aggressive spectrum. And what would that be? I think it's kind of just card salad decks at this point, like in here. Now, we do have a deck that is very aggressive, that is also very strong, and that is Bog Dweller. I'm not sure how to draw a Bog Dweller. I guess it looks like that. So, there we go. That's my Bog Dweller, okay? I thought I did an okay job. So, Bog Dweller, it's a very aggressive deck. I wouldn't say it's as fast as Manaless Aggro. It does take turns. Like it can play a turn of mana or whatever, but for the most part, it is very, very strong. Other than that, like aggro decks, maybe like a Deep Space Warrior deck, like my Weave deck that I showed off. Oh my god, I cannot draw Deep Space Warrior. Weave. Okay, Weave. Okay, that's my Weave deck. Maybe I'll draw one more line in there and one more line up here. Cool. Does that look like a Weave deck yet? Cool. So Weave and I'd say Weave is a little bit slower because it doesn't take every turn. Like this deck here just goes right in and hits you every turn that it can. This deck here hits you and then it backs off and then it hits you and then it backs off and then it finally goes in for the kill. But I would say that this deck is faster at getting to you and hitting you than this deck, the water deck. So yeah, that's probably going to be our spectrum of aggro decks. And then obviously along the bottom here at every level, you're going to have just some garbage. And the garbage, it may or may not actually do well against these other decks. But optimized decks that are what we're thinking of, and they're going to work on the top. So this deck here beats this deck probably, and probably loses to both of these decks. Now what else is rampant right now? We've got Azrael decks, and they're kind of similar to water in that they ramp up really quickly and then they're big, but they do ramp up. So maybe I'll put Azrael in the same thing, and the only thing I can really think about Azrael, I don't have him yet, is that he's an explodey boy. So we'll draw a little explosion. That looks like a flower. Cool. That's our explosion for Azrael. And that's probably as good as it's gonna get. These decks both do very well against these decks, which actually is a lot more of the meta than you would think. Like, there's a lot of people playing garbage. But they also do well against these decks. Now, what would be a super, super control-y deck? Well, something like Wasteland Control is pretty good, in my opinion. I would only say like any. I don't know how to draw a Wasteland at all. There, that's Wasteland. What else is Control right now? The problem is Control does not fill a lot of the meta. Ooh, Obelisk. Obelisk and Wasteland Control are definitely two setup decks. These are decks that set up like this, but they don't set up in quite the same way. They set up slower. Now, Wasteland Control does not set up. So, like, this is sort of a division here. These decks set up. Usually they're set up and then they're done early. Wasteland Control just tries to take control of the board. So that was like the shoot deck that I showed you guys, the commons only. That's like Wasteland Control, which I haven't shown you, but that might be my tournament deck. And I don't know, various other sort of control-y decks. I think also somewhere in here is Undying, probably around here. Undying. But Undying might be more into this sort of area. And usually what happens is if you're slightly slower, you'll beat, like so this deck here. The reason you can play Weave is because it beats this. And it honestly probably even has a good chance against this deck. And then this sort of deck beats this. Obelisk will beat Undying. Honestly, probably yeah. Undying isn't a super great archetype. It's almost in the garbage tier. And I don't know if it's better or worse than Water and Ezreal. But I think it has a decent chance. It's a little bit slower. It does set up a little bit better. I mean, maybe not anymore though. Back when Trigger Happy was the thing, this would have been Trigger Happy. But okay, maybe Undying is just garbage tier and everything beats it. Maybe this is just what we're gonna think about. And then again, I don't think I have any other like super. This is like your crazy combos like Gamester. I don't know how to draw a Gamester either. I'll draw a little die. One, two, and that would make this 5. Or 3, obviously. Oh no, that wouldn't make this 5, because 2 and 5 are opposite each other. That would make this 4. Cool. And then any sort of combo-y decks with Gamester or like Meteor. Although Meteor is kind of in this sort of cool. So here's Meteor, here's Gamester. They're kind of lower because Gamester's not as common, Meteor Finisher not as common, but they exist. And they're not as good, I wouldn't say. And we won't draw the division though. So anyways, back to what beats what. I would say that if you're looking to okay, so if you're looking to beat this meta, yeah, this sort of deck will probably do well against most of these. Like this deck probably has one of the higher win rates. And that tends to be Weave. Yeah, this deck will beat these two, and it's designed to beat Manaless aggro too. But this deck here is very, very strong. And I think that I think I should draw this differently, these arrows. That's what I think. How can I do this? Okay, so basically right now, these are the standout decks, right? We've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 6 sort of region type things of decks. These are meant for anti-aggro. So they will beat this. And they will beat this. Let's go downward arrows, go this side. Yeah. This deck is meant, well, so this deck against Manaless aggro, it's honestly probably pretty even. Never mind, this deck has heals. So it goes like that. This deck can be sort of all of these. Water, it loses to this deck, actually. So that's an arrow. What does it do against Weave? I think it wins. It's a little bit slower, and once it's set up, it just beats Weave. What does it do against this deck? That's the hard part. I think it doesn't necessarily win, but only, like, Water doesn't beat this aggro deck because this aggro deck kind of is a lot faster than Water. It's on top of Water, and Water buffs this aggro deck. Now, what is this? Azrael. Azrael has a decent chance against this deck. It gets big cards early, but I don't know if the explosions can hit the Heelys, then it works. But like for the most part, I don't think it's really that great of a matchup because Azrael is just like yeah, I don't think it's a great matchup at all because Azrael like this deck is on top of Azrael in a turn or two and just swinging 1 turn, well 2, and the explosions don't help you if you're next to them. So I'm going to say that a refined Azrael deck will actually lose this matchup. Maybe a card solid Azrael deck will win it. But yeah, so we're going to do this line and this line. And then we've already done Weave, so this line is guaranteed. Actually, here, I'm sorry. To make this, there we go. There we go. Okay. Now, that's sort of the bottom half of the ladder done. We do have to talk about how these decks fare against the others. And that's going to mean that we're going to cross here, but what can we do? Obelisk and Gamester decks, sort of like really late setup decks, will beat any of these. Any sort of garbage. We can kind of assume that garbage won't beat anything, but it will probably do well against this deck sometimes. Sometimes it won't. And it will probably do well against this deck sometimes. Sometimes it won't. And I might be missing a deck or two in here, but like there's another swamp deck that's probably more like swarmy and stuff, and it's probably in this sort of area, but that's whatever. So anyways, this deck will, hmm. Okay, so it's against water. Water will set up and be strong, but then this thing will set up and potentially be stronger. Israel, Israel sets up harder than water, I would say. It's also faster a little bit. Well, okay. So I'm gonna say that this deck has an interesting time against this deck. I'm gonna say it's about even, honestly. Against these decks, though, this deck actually does really, really poorly against Weave because Weave can play aggro if it wants. This deck does very well against that deck, and this deck does pretty well against that deck. So we can just draw a triple arrow from aggro over to this area. Maybe I'll actually all of aggro tends to beat this. Now, this deck, yeah, I think it probably sets up hard enough to beat this deck, to be honest. So that's sort of what this is for. It also has an okay time against like these setup decks, but I would say that like Wasteland Control definitely beats both of these. This sort of does well against Comet setup, but that's partially because it sort of blocks Comet setup in both scenarios. So I would say like in general, this sort of tempo area though, you would beat this. Now, this is actually a very high win rate deck in general. It will also come all the way over here and beat this deck. It will also come all the way over here and beat this deck. This deck is complicated. It's kind of an even matchup. I won't put an arrow at all. This deck, Wasteland Control does very well against water. I've never played it against Israel. So I'm gonna put this line. Now you'll notice, actually I think this, well, there are ways to beat control. You'll notice that I might be overrating this. Let's say this happens. But in general, we'll see that the strongest sort of archetypes are aggro, any sort of aggro, specifically these two, because they beat these decks, and they beat these decks. And for the most part, they beat trash. Especially this deck. Like, this deck, and even this deck, they just destroy trash. This deck, not always, but for the most part it will too. Now, these decks are strong because they beat this deck. That's about it, to be honest. They're not super played anymore. They used to be a lot more played because they build themselves. People will say that Israel is good. Um, I could see it being okay against some of these earlier aggro decks too. And I could see it beating these decks. But to be honest, I don't know. We'll see. I'll have to wait until I get the card. Now, these, yeah, so we talked about these decks and these decks. These decks people play because they're fun. That's it. They're fun concepts that turned out to be garbage. Usually they're around this time zone. Sometimes they're in the aggro side. Sometimes they're over here. In fact, like you could argue that these decks are garbage too. um, they're played mostly because they're fun as well. They also happen to do pretty well against these decks, but sometimes these decks will go and win that matchup too. These decks are played because they're amazing. Well, not so much Comet. Comet's just kind of fun, but big finisher decks like you could replace this with Vile Bog or any other sort of big finisher deck. Hell, you could argue that when this deck hits its second Bog Lurcher, then it actually becomes this deck. because, well, it's probably more like one of these decks. But it's like big finisher and get a lot of mana. Sometimes actually, Gamester actually plays around Comet sort of idea. Anyways, this would have been like trigger happy. Well, that would have been trigger happy. It's kind of complicated. Anyways, this is like a slower deck. In fact, you could argue that this is a garbage deck. But anyways, it's very like this side of the spectrum. Any control deck is usually very strong actually. It beats these decks, which are again arguably garbage. It beats these decks for the most part. This might be the only deck that can actually come up here. Um, and it beats all these aggro decks except for potentially this one. So yeah, if we're looking at like overall metagame, what should I play? Well, this is where it actually gets interesting, and this is where I'll draw an eraser. So, while the metagame is young, first of all, if there's ever a ranked ladder, play aggro at the start, because that's how you climb. These decks, like this deck, the game is over super quick. Same thing with this deck. So you know early on whether or not you've won or whether you're done. And then you can just hop into another game, get more rank. But what should you play now? This deck is considered to be one of the stronger ones because it won a tournament recently and because it's strong. This deck here is considered quite strong. I don't have enough experience to talk about it. And this deck here is very strong, which people aren't really talking about. Now, this deck here is also quite fun, or quite good. It sort of just punishes anyone who doesn't build their deck properly, because an unoptimized version of this deck, or this deck, or even this deck, especially this deck actually, will lose. In fact, I would say like in order of like what this deck beats, it would be like this, followed by this, followed by unoptimized this, maybe even like unoptimized this, this, unoptimized this, unoptimized this. So anyways, this is a very good deck for punishing people who don't build optimally, and you should play it in the early stages of the game until people are playing a lot of like Castle Knight sort of cards in their control decks. Then once they are, then you might want to just switch to control, because control, the nice thing about it is that it's built to beat the meta. Like when you're playing control, you throw in some cards that beat everything that is being played. So I would throw in some cards to beat this deck. I would throw in some cards to beat this deck. I would throw in some cards to beat this deck. And then people would have to stop playing those decks if they wanted to beat me. Now often they would just become control, and then I would have to figure out a way to beat control, which is usually something unexpected, like these decks. That's where these decks really actually shine, is that they're unexpected. But that you can beat them with aggro. So like if you're like a true meta game player, you could actually win every meta by having this deck and this deck. Maybe sometimes having this deck, because eventually this deck expects this deck. But yeah. Um. Anyways, that's sort of what I'm trying to say here. These are the common decks. Make up your own trash, but make it good. That obviously is what lots of people are going to be doing. And so that's why like having a refined list makes you so much better. Now, when we're looking into tournament season, which should be soonish, you're going to want to think about playing around most of these decks. Most people are going to be bringing a refined version of one of these decks. I like this deck personally. I think that more people will be playing it. I don't know how many people will be playing this because it feels a little bit like a, I don't know, like a cheese to play aggro. But to be honest, it's very strong. And then I think a lot of people will be playing. I think a lot of people will be playing something in this range, like somewhere in here, because they just have this idea of like. There's so many people who are like one-trick ponies. They have this deck and they want to make it work, or they have this deck and they just think it's so fun. Um, yeah. And then I think that Wasteland has been seeing a lot more attention recently, which I don't necessarily like because, well, you know. But anyways, I think that this deck might see some more play in tournaments too. So I guess I sort of said them all. This deck won't see a lot of play, I don't think, partially because not a lot of people have been playing with it, but stuff like that. Um, so really, what you need to focus on is like you look at these, right? And then maybe for the early game, you play this deck. And you play like something that beats. You play something that ignores these and focuses on beating these and these and these and these. Maybe not these. Or maybe you play something like this, and then, or even this actually. And then in the first like round, if your opponent is bad, you can just play this deck because you know that they're probably not going to have an optimized deck that can beat it. But then what you want to look at and build for the later rounds is which of these decks do you think will do well? So in this, I think that anyone playing Manaless Aggro, which isn't very many, will be moving on. And then I think that anyone playing this deck will 100% move on. This is my deck to beat. And I think that this deck is very popular, but I don't know if that means it will move on. So I might make a bold prediction that this will not move on. So this is my deck to beat, and I honestly like these decks. They probably won't. This deck will move on, in my opinion. So now I have to try to build a deck that beats this deck, and that beats this deck. Now you could reference my arrows from earlier and see, maybe that Manaless Aggro does pretty well against both of those. Or maybe you make your own garbage deck that does really well against both of them. But what I intend to do is stick with this and try to beat my own kind by having a more optimized deck because oh my god, the Wasteland decks I'm seeing right now are not optimized. And then also try to build it around beating that. Anyways, that's sort of my guide to preparing for a tournament and beating the meta for Domain. Well, I can just do this. I hope that you enjoyed it, and I hope that you learned something. Goodbye.